Well, last week we had Rohatsu, the Feast of the Enlightenment of the Buddha, on December 8th, which is the same day as I mentioned, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, Christ's mother, in the Catholic liturgy. As promised last week, I said we would look at the comparative stories of the birth of these two major figures, Siddhartha Gautama and Jesus of Nazareth. And it is quite fascinating. I gave a little retreat on it, but I did a little more extra research now for this. Marcus Borg, who was a Protestant theologian, did a book called Jesus and Buddha, the Parallel Sayings, introduction by Jack Kornfield. And I had a friend who sent me daily quotes and comparisons from this book over the past year. So I got it. It marshals a comparative text. It doesn't really go into it in great depth. So at your risk, but it has certain usefulness. Marcus Borg says in the editor's preface, as a Christian, I've lived with Jesus all my life. I've not lived with the Buddha, but in adulthood, I've become a non-exclusivist Christian, of course, which I think is the only kind to be. But it seems clear that the sacred has been known in all of the major religious traditions. I do not think that Christianity is the only adequate religion, even though it is my home. Ditto. Thus, I write as a Jesus scholar and a devoted but non-exclusivist Christian. Buddhists might see matters differently. I know that some Christians would, indeed. But the cumulative product of my thinking and experience is the conclusion that Jesus and the Buddha are the two most remarkable religious figures who have ever lived. I agree. They're the two major religious figures in the history of the world, in our view. Moreover, there are striking similarities between them, and that's the point of the book, and we'll see in a few minutes. I've sometimes said that if the Buddha and Jesus were to meet, of course they have, they're one up there, wherever they are, neither would try to convert the other. Why would they? They both share the same experience. Not because they would regard such an effort as hopeless, but because they would recognize one another. Absolutely. Okay. So anyway, I agree with all that. But the parallels, are quite striking, obviously in the teaching, but even in the life stories. So we'll look at those as we approach Christmas, the birth of Christ, and all of that. It's a good time to look at this. Now, many Christian scholars have pointed out, and Elizabeth Johnson does it very well in a section of her book on Mary that I've been reviewing. Truly Our Sister, one of her earlier books. But she's pointed out what many scholars have pointed out, that in both the case of the Buddha and Jesus, their followers, remember, neither of them wrote anything. They were too busy being enlightened to sit down and write. Those who aren't enlightened sit down and write. Anyway, that's that's a little extreme. The point being that it was their followers who would start writing things and supposedly write what Buddha said or Jesus said, hopefully more or less accurately. But the thing was, they started with the great mystery, and then they projected back to the beginning. So they didn't start with, here's the story of the birth of the Buddha, the birth of Jesus, and then following the whole story. They start with the end. And they say, wow, this great figure, so we got to figure out, where he came from. Right. So as Elizabeth Johnson points out, in Jesus' case, it's particularly clear. You start with the resurrection and the passion. That's the primary gospel. Then you project back, for example, in Mark's gospel, the earliest gospel, to the baptism, where then you have the revelation of Jesus and his relationship with the Father as the Son. This is my beloved Son. And then Matthew and Luke are the only ones that have any kind of infancy narratives that we read on Christmas. So they project even further back. This must be the way how we came into the world. And they gather the stories from who knows where, but anyway. And a lot of it's allegorical, of the Magi, the star, and all of that. We don't know when he was born or anything like that. And then in John's gospel, the latest gospel, that is to say, the last written, then you go all the way back to, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So, wow, it goes all the way back into infinity, before all time. But you see, that's the natural progression. You start from the end and you go further and further back, and hopefully it's dependable in some kind of way. But that's the way it worked in both cases. Now, obviously, especially in Jesus' case, it's particularly clear. So, given that, where did they come from? All right, now, as I just said, the Christian tradition finally saw this is the incarnation of the Word. This was God Himself. As we later it took a couple of centuries before it became the second person of the Trinity. Was clearly as the Trinity was clearly established as a doctrine. That became flesh, dwelt among us. With the Buddha, it's very interesting. Up in I forget where the place is, Upper New York State, the Shinyans, Dharmadrum, I think. They have this huge Buddha statue, the largest one I think in North America. And on either side of it, they have 1,000 little Buddhas. And they're his previous lives. So he had to come from somewhere too. In order for him to work up to the enlightenment, to the enlightened being that he became, the Siddhartha Gautama, he had to live 1,000 lives. So that wasn't the first time, And there are even Buddhist scriptures called the Jatakas. The 547 Jatakas are birth stories, allegorical tales relating the Buddha's previous births. So out of those 1,000, let's say, you've got more than half of them which have stories about his previous life. So that's really interesting. And oftentimes he was a king or an important person the same way he was in his actual life as Siddhartha. And some of the stories show the way he was evolving. In one case, to save a dove from a falcon, he put the dove on a scale and took some of his own flesh to equal the weight to save the dove. Have you ever seen the imagery of Jesus as a pelican, taking his own flesh and feeding it to his young? That was what pelicans supposedly did. Understanding. It's the same kind of idea. You give of your very flesh in order to save others. Interesting. Another story where the king gives up his kingship and becomes a monk, and his wife enters a convent. So he's well on his way, you see, to devoting everything to the spiritual life. Interesting. The story is he was already such an enlightened being. He was in the 33rd heaven, in the Hindu and some of the Buddhist scriptures, you have these 33 heavens. And I've seen pictures of this when I was in Myanmar, for example. You start with the Buddha up there in one of the heavens, the Buddhist heavens, waiting to come down. So instead of the Word of God in all eternity coming down and becoming flesh, you have the Buddha after 900 and some lives in the Buddhist heaven, which is where the really righteous go, waiting to come down one final time to save us, to become enlightened and to enlighten all sentient beings. So that's interesting to compare, the cosmologies and see how that works out. So that's what happened. Now, how did they come? Now here it gets interesting too. Because the Buddha became in the Shakya clan. His father was a king. This was not the Brahmins. This was the next class down, the Kshatriyas, I think you call it, the class. And Queen Maya was the wife, and so she was going to become the mother of the Buddha. Now, remember, Mary had an angel come and speak to her, and Joseph had a dream. Well, Queen Mara had a dream, according to the story, the universally accepted story. She had the dream of an elephant, a white elephant, symbol of royalty, and coming down into her. And that was not the actual incarnation of the Buddha, the way we say the Holy Spirit came down upon Mary. He was conceived, through his father, the Buddha. But the dream was, of this royal, divine, being coming down, quotes, divine, from the realm of the gods, the realm of the heavens, coming down into her. And then, of course, the story is that as the time came for Queen Mara to give birth, she stood in the garden in Lumbini. I've been there. Some decades ago, there was this huge attempt to make this enormous international park with all sorts of monasteries and fountains and things in Lumbini. I was there in Nepal, present-day Nepal, where the Buddha was born. It didn't really come to anything, but they do have a lot of monasteries there. But anyway, she was there, a couple of us to the capital, and she was holding onto the branch of a tree. And that's how she gave birth. And if you see the depictions, the Buddha came out of her side. So you see, there's always an attempt to make the birth and the coming of these great figures somehow unusual, corresponding to their celestial dignity. Whether it's the virgin birth from Mary or the birth from the side of the Queen Mary. So it's really fascinating. And of course, these are just the legends. Obviously didn't come from her side, presumably, but Christian doctrine from the beginning had Mary ever virgin, that even in the birth it was just like he passed through her like light. It's actually what the belief is. But it's all an attempt to show that this verse is the birth had special dignity and a whole aura about it to correspond to the dignity and the mission of the people. So that's the instinct, that's the desire to be able to affirm that. And then there are all sorts of crazy stories, like the Buddha took 7 steps as soon as he was born, or he took 7 steps in each of the directions, all these legends that go along with it. And that there were little miracles that happened. In the apocryphal Gospels, Jesus, when he was a little kid, made a clay bird and it brought it to life, and all these things. It gets more and more, apocryphal, and fantastic. But that's the instinct, to be able to affirm that the births, were in a special way. Now, the virgin birth with Mary has always been strongly affirmed in the Christian tradition, based on the Gospels. But again, it's an effort to present, Christ coming in a very special way. For example, one of the texts that Marcus Borg says that after the Buddha was conceived, Mara had no sensual thoughts. So an attempt almost to make her, virginal, beyond all. And then she died. She died very shortly after the Buddha's death. Maybe was that a way of, one of the books I was reading speculated that was a way of making sure that she didn't have any other kids. After the Buddha, how could you have another child after the Buddha? Well, the same with Mary. Mary's ever virgin. She had no more children after Jesus. The same kind of instinct is at work there. And maybe historically true, but that's the instinct there to affirm that. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger, who most of you know became Pope Benedict, who is no liberal, said, in his book, The Introduction to Christianity, some decades ago, that there is no absolute metaphysical intrinsic reason that Jesus had to be born of a virgin in order to be divine. Now, that's really important. Jesus did not have to be born of a virgin in order to be divine. But, as he said, because of the testimony and the tradition, the testimony of the Gospels and tradition, we believe that. But it is interesting to note, what is true, and this is Elizabeth Johnson affirms very well, is that born of the Spirit, or conceived by the Spirit, is a way of saying that the Spirit took all the initiative, the Spirit of God took all initiative in the birth and the incarnation, and even in the life of Jesus, he lived continually by the Spirit. The Spirit came down upon him in the baptism, etc. That all was, under the tutelage and under the initiative of the Spirit. And that's what the fathers of the Church said too, that this wasn't a human decision. It wasn't the will of man, as the Gospel of Prologue of John says. It wasn't the will of the flesh or the will of man, but the will of God. So it's a new beginning in that sense, and there's a real truth there. This is in a sense, in some sense, a new beginning for humanity. Now, what's really interesting is as a new affirmation of that from a whole new perspective. I mean, Elizabeth Johnson actually has a feminist perspective, like, what do you need a man for? You know, she even quotes Sojourner Truth back in the 19th century, who said the same thing in the face of the pastor who said, women don't have all these rights because Christ was a man. Well, where did he come from? She said, you need a man for that. But in her book, The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, seeing the Law of Three as the radical truth at the center of all of reality, which if you ever really want to delve into something profound, you can read. In her presentation of the Law of Three and the energy of the continual threes working their way through history, she comes to the Incarnation and affirms the virgin birth from a whole new perspective, which is very profound. She says, from its earliest centuries, Christian tradition has insisted that Jesus is a singularity, not merely a prophet, not even an avatar, as the term is typically understood in the Asian traditions, but a unique and pivotal cosmic event. She's saying something new, as the Father said. And that his singularity has everything to do with the circumstances of his lineage and conception. This insistence, which confounds the literal mind and remains obscure even at the level of allegory, finds its real explanation at the metaphysical level. An arising in the usual fashion of merely human parentage would still be under the old order, not the new law of three moving forward. Operating within the laws and conditions governing material existence as provided through the triads before. This new configuration, Father and Spirit, and giving rise through Mary, giving rise to the incarnate Jesus, fulfills the required next sequence of the progression of the law of three and drives it inevitably forward. As Christian tradition has accurately intuited, Jesus, the new arising from this new triad, becomes the cornerstone of a new creation. Fascinating. So, in any case, something new is happening, in both traditions. Now, this is an interesting story. It goes back, the Buddhas, the parents, they invited holy monks from up in the mountains nearby. We're in Nepal, after all, from the Himalayas, and they came down to offer their prophecy. It's kind of like the Magi, but even more, as Borg points out, it's like Simeon in the temple. Remember, Jesus was presented in the temple, and Simeon, the old prophet, said, this is the salvation of Israel, and now I can die in peace because my eyes have seen the salvation of Israel and the light for the revelation to the Gentiles. Well, something very similar happens here. The seer, his name is Asita, was invited by the king Siddhartha on the birth of his son, and much to the bewilderment of the assembled courtiers, Asita proclaimed that the young prince would become a universal teacher, either a great king or a universal spiritual, great spiritual figure, especially if he ever experienced suffering. So just as Simeon proclaimed, the sword will pierce your thought that would be destined for the rise and fall of many in Israel, here Asita is proclaiming this man is going to become, a great spiritual teacher that will, rock the world. Jesus and Mary kept all these things. Mary kept all these things in her heart, but King Siddhartha said, I got to stop this. I don't want to. So he's going to make sure my son never experiences suffering. And you know the story. Then that he was kept for, until he was, in his late 20s, he was kept free from any contact with the outside world and its suffering and death, and until he went out on his own and met, not only a monk but someone old, someone sick, and a corpse, and started, his spiritual journey. But that's for the next stage, maybe around Lent when we have the beginning of the public ministry. So you see, there is a great difference, of course, in the social status. The Buddha was born a prince, and that gives him a certain advantage, in life and starting out and, finding a place in the world. Whereas Jesus, not at all. And there's, of course, a great lesson there, in the revelation to the shepherds, no room at the inn, being a refugee in Egypt, all these stories which show that he's identifying with the poor and the lowly, which is very eloquent and important. And of course, the Buddha, too, eventually, was classless in his presentation. But But that's a considerable difference. And yet, the ultimate proclamation is that we are all kings. You know, we all have royal dignity. We're all children of God, or however you want to say it. You know, we all have inestimable inner spiritual worth. That's a metaphor for that, as well as a social reality. And one final thing here, since we're talking about these years before the ministries began, and both of them started around the age of 30, in our early 30s. Interesting. So Borg speaks a bit about, you know, the theories. Well, where did they get their wisdom? You know, you'll see that the Buddha went out and he did the ascetical thing, and he, you know, did all the the sitting, sitting on under the Bodhi tree and all. But say, well, where did Jesus get it? You hear about the hidden life. Was he just a carpenter? What did he do all that time? He was near the city of Sepphoris, which near Nazareth, which was an international trade route crossing. Did he meet people there? Did he go to Tibet? Did he find supposedly documents that show that there was somebody by his name or something that studied in Tibet? I agree with Borg. He says this is not necessary. I mean, there's certainly no proof of it, and it's not necessary. They both were inner directed and had profound inner experiences, and that's where they got their wisdom. And since they both had profound inner experiences, of course, they're brothers. If you have profound inner experiences, you're going to meet. You know, there's a great resemblance, you know, to their message, because they both experienced reality, and reality is one. So I agree with Borg when he says they both had deep inner experiences, and that's how they found their wisdom. They were, if you like, spiritual geniuses or graced or whatever words you want to call it. They had a special mission, special calling, and a special dignity in that way. And he does mention the fact, well, Jesus called his Father, seemed to be personal, whereas it wasn't the case with the Buddha. Well, again, it's largely cultural. You know, even the Christian mystics as well as Jewish mystics, you know, go beyond the names to the ultimate infinite reality, which the Buddha obviously did. And so even that, I think, is, as he suggests, is comparable. Beyond words, certainly beyond our egos, and beyond anything we can attain on our own. But that brings us to the next episode. So anyway, those are some of the correspondences and the comparisons and the differences and the similarities, and I think it's pretty interesting from a hermeneutical point of view, a spiritual point of view, and intellectual point of view. It's quite fascinating. Any comments or questions?
I have a question. And in the comparison of Buddhist teaching and Christian teaching.
Okay, we haven't even talked about the teaching, but go ahead.
Well, we don't talk about it. So, anatta, the Zen teaching of nothingness. After you die, there's nothing.
Well, that's not true.
But that's what I just read. So clarify.
No, Buddhists themselves will argue about this. But say, well, anatta, all that is saying is that there's no self in the sense of the little teeny separate ego self that we think is ourself. That's an illusion. And more Christians should realize that. But to say, therefore, that there's nothing, I mean, that's completely false. In her book on the Buddha, Karen Armstrong, affirms that very strongly. That they're not nihilists. Buddhists are not nihilists. Even they're talking about emptiness, what they really mean is it's so enormous and huge and magnificent and infinite, and that you can't name it, you can't conceptualize it.
So they believe that there's something that gets reincarnated.
It's not something.
What gets reincarnated?
Well, that's just energy passing and taking different forms. But ultimately, it's all one.
They certainly die in a different way, don't they?
Die? Oh, that's true. Yes, but I have my own presentation on that too. We'll get to that next Lent.
Okay.
Next Holy Week. It's not really that different when you look at it more closely. Their attitude towards suffering and how they take it on for all of humanity.
Well, one difference which sometimes I made, especially among the kind of Buddhist convert, I say, well, the gospel
So were their scriptures.
Yeah, but it was much closer to the life of Jesus than what was written
That's
by
right.
Buddha.
That's true.
It was written in two different languages.
Very
And they say, well, we know what Buddha said clearly. When Jesus it was transformed.
That's
It's
nonsense.
not true.
Of course it's not true. That's
And-
ridiculous.
Yeah. On a different note, there is also an interesting comparison between Buddha and Socrates on that trial. The
Socrates.
apology of Plato is very interesting as a comparison with what happened to Jesus. Well, of course, it was only one night.
Yeah, you can bring
But
Socrates.
it's
Yeah, you
usual
can
because
compare with
there are
Socrates.
so many similarities.
Mm, yeah. All right. Well, let's do the vow.